Anki is one of the most effective tools in medical school. However, it's only effective if it's used in the right way. These are my top 5 principles to making easy and effective Anki cards. Tip number 1, understand the information. Before you put something in an Anki card, you should make sure to understand the information rather than just rote memorizing it. The reason for this is because if you understand something, then there's somewhere for that information to latch onto in your brain. You've built yourself a mental framework of where to put that information. However, if you don't understand it, there's no way of contextualizing what you're learning, and so your brain has a hard time figuring out where to actually place that information. Another way of thinking of it is if you try and just memorize something without understanding it, there are no connections for that information to fall back of. So the information is very loosely structured in your mind. And it might be easy to think that you've understood something, but the real way of actually testing it is trying to explain to yourself that concept, or to someone else, to a friend. Explain that concept that you've tried learning. You may find that you don't know how to explain something properly. That way you've discovered a gap in your knowledge, and so you might need to go back and relearn that information properly. Another technique you can use is called the Feynman technique, which is basically where you get a piece of paper and write down the information as if you were explaining it to a 10-year-old. You can also do this in a speech format where you just talk to yourself or talk to someone else, but essentially you're explaining your concept like you do to a child. And the idea is that if you're able to explain something to a child, then you've understood it well enough. Otherwise, you might just be using medical jargon and not actually understanding the concepts thoroughly. The second point is keep it short and simple. Now, the tips in my video are inspired by an article called 20 Rules of Formulating Knowledge, which I'll link in the description below. But essentially this point comes from the minimum information principle, which is basically the idea that your cards should just have 1 or 2 pieces of information or knowledge attached to it. This doesn't mean that every single card has to be easy, but what it does mean is that your cards are simple and that there's less work to do per card when you're reviewing them. And another concept this ties in closely with is testing your knowledge from different angles. So for example, if there's a question and an answer, you might like to create an answer and a question type card to make sure you're testing both sides of that information. If there's a certain word and your card is the definition, you might want to also add a definition and then your word as the answer. Now you might think, oh okay, but this is just going to increase my workload because it's going to mean that I have more cards to review. But actually it's going to be more efficient because you're going to spend less time on each single card, and you're going to test your knowledge from different angles, so actually it's better to make your cards that way. If however you do have separate cards but there's one common theme to it, then you also want to have a card asking every single component of that theme. That way you're more likely to link things together and less likely to forget each concept in that card. Number 3 is using images. Now you've already probably heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it's very true, adding images to your card helps to add context and also helps to create that visual aid as part of that memory. It's especially important in topics that require lots of images. For example, in dermatology, you make a lot of spot diagnosis just by looking at rashes and stuff. So you're going to want to add those different images to form a clear picture of what things look like in your mind. And it's a lot more interesting when you have cards with pictures rather than just having plain text cards all the time, which can get a lot boring. And for things like anatomy, you can use occlusion cards where you essentially block out each aspect that you're trying to identify, and that links things you're learning to the overall picture rather than learning things one by one without images. Number 4 is avoiding memorizing lists. Now the reason for this is it's easier to identify what you're forgetting if your items are split up 1 to 1. If you've got a list of say 4 items but it's only the last thing that you keep getting wrong, you're going to have to press again on the entire card, meaning that the first 3 things that you already knew keeps coming back again, which is not the most efficient way to learn. Instead, if those 4 concepts were split up into different cards 1 by 1, then only the last card that you got wrong would have to be again, and the other 3 would, come out later because you're already remembering those cards. However, this is harder said than done in medicine, where there are lots of lists to remember, causes of things, risk factors of things. Of course, there are loads of lists. And I need to work on avoiding lists myself, but where possible, what I do is try to break down each component of that list into separate cards and use context cues. For example, if I was making a card about the risk factors for a certain disease, and then one of the risk factors is genetics, I might split that up into a separate card and use, genes or genetics as one of the context cues. And wherever possible, try and either come up with mnemonics or use mnemonics that already exist to aid your learning where there are cases where you can't avoid lists. Another thing, if you can't avoid lists, is to try and think systematically. For example, is there a step-by-step approach that something is done, if it's like a management of a certain condition, or if it's thinking about causes of something, can I do it systematically, like going from the top of the body to the bottom? But essentially, by having some sort of order to your list, you're much more likely to remember it than just if it's a random list with no order. Now, number 5 is avoiding memory interference. Now, if you haven't heard of this already, essentially it's where you do a card, but then you get confused with the answer of a different card. You might not have even noticed that this happens, but the reason it happens is because there are certain links that your brain is forming, and it might be overlapping or making the wrong links between different concepts. It's important to identify memory interference as soon as it occurs, otherwise your memory will just be reinforcing that wrong information over and over again, and later down the line it will be much harder to fix. And so the way to be more aware of memory interference occurring is to recognize when you get a card wrong and to realize if you're mixing that concept with another already existing card. If you are, then you need to edit both of those cards to make them as unambiguous as possible. There might be certain things that overlap, such as risk factors being the same for a certain condition, or it might be something else that there's a common link that's causing you to create that confusion between those two different cards. Whatever the reason is, your aim is to ensure that when a certain card comes up, there's only one possible answer and one possible answer only, and that you don't get confused with different other concepts. A way to find out cards that might have been causing memory interference for you is to go and check your leech cards. These are cards that you're getting frequently wrong, and so try and find out what the reason is that you keep getting these wrong. It may be that you need to go back and relearn that concept, or it may be that your card has too much information so you need to split it into separate cards, or it may be because of memory interference, in which case you need to identify and correct it as soon as it occurs. If you like these tips, then you might want to check out my Master Anki in Medical School playlist, which I'll link somewhere here, which contains everything you need to know about how to make effective Anki cards in medical school, step by step, the entire process. If you're new to my channel, my name is Abhiyan. I'm a medical student studying in London. If you want to sign up to my weekly newsletter Swift Sunday, I'll leave a link in the description below. With that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you again in my next video.